They say that grief is a desert, and for Mary Thornton, the silence left by her husband Thomas was deafening. No inheritances, no large bank accounts. All he left her was a yellowed envelope and a key to a property that no one knew existed. When Mary finally arrived at the location, she didn't find a house. She found a mountain of vegetation, a forgotten cabin that seemed to have been devoured by time. In the first moment, despair took over. She felt betrayed, left alone with a worthless ruin. But when Mary forced the door open and the first petals began to fall, the fragrance hit her like a punch to the chest. What Thomas had hidden beneath those vines for decades wasn't just a house. It was a miracle planned down to the last detail. When she finally crossed the threshold, Mary fell to her knees and burst into tears. What was inside would change her life and our perception of love forever. Before we reveal what Thomas left behind, I want to ask you a question. Do you believe that those we love can protect us even after they're gone? If you believe in the power of love and in thrilling plot twists, subscribe to the channel now. Leave your like so that this story of faith reaches more people who need a miracle today. And now, let's go back to the moment when Mary discovered the key, and the journey to Thomas's best-kept secret began. The house felt wrong without Thomas in it. Mary Thornton, 65 years old and newly widowed, moved through the rooms of their small home like a ghost haunting her own life. 40 years of marriage didn't simply end when someone died. It echoed. It left spaces that couldn't be filled. Thomas had passed away 3 weeks ago, pancreatic cancer, discovered too late to treat aggressively, but caught early enough that he had 3 relatively peaceful months to prepare. He'd spent that time finishing things. Paperwork, repairs around the house, quiet conversations with Mary about memories they'd collected like pressed flowers over 4 decades together. He'd been 68. They'd been planning to travel more, to finally take that trip to the botanical gardens in England that Thomas had always wanted to see. Instead, Mary had planned a funeral. The service had been small. They had no children, a choice they'd made early in their marriage, content with each other's company. Thomas had been a quiet man who worked as a groundskeeper for the local parks department, spending his days among trees and flowers. Mary had taught second grade for 30 years before retiring. They'd lived simply, happily, without the need for grand gestures or expensive things, which was why the financial situation after Thomas's death came as such a shock. There was almost nothing. The house was paid off, but there were no savings to speak of. Thomas's pension ended with his death. Mary's teacher's retirement was modest at best. She'd known they lived paycheck to paycheck, but she'd assumed Thomas had some plan, some safety net she didn't know about. There wasn't one. The lawyer had been apologetic but clear. "Mrs. Thornton, I'm sorry. There's the house and about $3,000 in the checking account. That's all." "That can't be right," Mary had said, confused. "Thomas worked for 40 years. There must be something." The lawyer had shaken his head. "If there is, I don't have record of it. This is everything listed in his will." Mary had left that office feeling betrayed in a way she couldn't quite articulate. How could Thomas have left her with nothing? How could he have been so irresponsible? Now, 3 weeks later, she was cleaning out his belongings, trying to make sense of a future that felt impossibly empty and frighteningly uncertain. Thomas's side of the closet still smelled like him, a mixture of soil, Old Spice, and something green and alive that he'd always carried with him. Mary had been avoiding this task, but it needed to be done. She couldn't live surrounded by his ghost forever. She started with the obvious: shirts, pants, shoes. All would go to donation. As she worked through the hangers, something fell from the top shelf and landed at her feet with a soft thud. An envelope. Old, yellowed with age, sealed with wax that had cracked over time. On the front, in Thomas's careful handwriting, "For Mary, when the sun seems like it will never shine again." Mary's hands shook as she picked it up. She sat down on the bed and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a small iron key, and what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. The letter was brief. "My dearest Mary, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're facing days that feel impossibly dark. I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to hold your hand through this. I know you're probably angry with me right now. You're probably looking at our finances and wondering why I didn't do more, plan better, leave you more secure. I need you to trust that I did plan. I just didn't plan in ways you could see. The key and map will lead you to what I've spent the last 25 years building. I couldn't tell you about it while I was alive. You would have told me I was crazy, that I was wasting time and money we didn't have. Maybe you would have been right. But I needed to do this. For you. For us. Please, go there. Please see what I made. Even if it seems like nothing at first, please look closer. I built this place for you, Mary. Every seed, every stone, every moment I spent away on weekends, it was all for you. The address is on the map. Go there. See what love looks like when it has 25 years to grow. Forever yours, Thomas. Mary read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. 25 years. Thomas had been working on some secret project for 25 years and never told her. She unfolded the map. It was hand-drawn, showing a route from their town to what appeared to be a remote area about 40 miles away in the mountains. At the end of the route was a small X marked with the words, "Our Sanctuary." The key was old iron, the kind that opened antique locks, heavy and solid in her palm. Mary sat on their bed, her bed now, holding these 3 items, feeling a mixture of emotions so complex she couldn't name them all. Confusion, curiosity, anger, hope, betrayal, love. Thomas had kept a secret from her for 25 years. A quarter of their marriage had apparently involved something she knew nothing about. All those weekends he'd said he was working on a project. All those Saturdays and Sundays, he disappeared for hours, coming home tired but oddly satisfied. He'd been going to this place, whatever it was, and he'd never said a word. Part of Mary wanted to throw the envelope away, to be furious with him for his secrets. But another part, the part that had loved Thomas Thornton for 40 years, through good times and hard times, through the ordinary days that made up a life, that part whispered that she needed to trust him one more time. The next morning, Mary packed a small bag, printed out directions using the map's landmarks as a guide, and got in her car. She was going to find Thomas's secret. The drive took just over an hour, leading Mary deeper into the mountains than she'd been in years. She'd always known Thomas loved nature. It was what had drawn her to him initially, the way he could name every wildflower, the way he spoke about trees like they were old friends. But this seemed excessive. This seemed like obsession. As the roads became narrower and less maintained, Mary's anger grew. What had Thomas been thinking? They'd struggled financially their entire marriage. There had been years when they'd barely scraped by, when Mary had worried about making the mortgage payment, when they'd eaten simply and skipped vacations because money was tight. And all that time, Thomas had apparently been spending money and effort on some secret property in the middle of nowhere. "What were you thinking?" Mary said aloud to the empty car. "We could have used that money. We could have had a little cushion, a little security. Instead, you were out here doing—" "What? Playing in the woods like a child?" The betrayal felt sharp and fresh. How could he have kept this from her? In 40 years of marriage, they'd built everything on trust and honesty. Or so she'd thought. Mary's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the road became little more than a dirt path. Her small sedan wasn't meant for this kind of terrain. She scraped bottom twice on rocks, making her wince. "This better be worth it, Thomas," she muttered. "This better be something amazing, because right now I'm having a hard time forgiving you." According to the map, she was close. The landmarks matched. The split oak tree, the creek crossing, the old stone wall. She should be able to see the property any moment now. The trees opened up into a small clearing, and Mary pulled over, consulting the map. This was it. This was the location Thomas had marked. But she didn't see anything that looked like a building. Just dense vegetation, wild overgrowth, and what appeared to be a massive mound of green. Mary got out of the car, taking Thomas's map and key with her. The afternoon sun was warm, but here in the mountains, the air carried a coolness that spoke of elevation and isolation. She walked toward the green mound, pushing through overgrown grass that reached her knees. As she got closer, she began to see something underneath all the vegetation, straight lines that nature didn't make, corners that suggested human construction. It was a building, or it had been once. Mary felt her heart sink as she got close enough to see the reality of Thomas's sanctuary. It was a cabin, small and simple, but it was completely engulfed by plant life. Vines as thick as her arm covered every surface, climbing over what must have been the roof, cascading down the walls, so dense and intertwined that the structure beneath was barely visible. The vegetation formed a living blanket, green and wild and seemingly impenetrable. Other plants had joined the vines, climbing roses with thorns, morning glory with purple flowers, jasmine that sent tendrils everywhere, ivy that gripped with thousands of small fingers. The entire structure looked like it was being slowly consumed by the forest, dragged back into nature by green arms that refused to let go. "Oh, Thomas," Mary whispered, her voice breaking. "What did you do?" This wasn't a sanctuary. This was a ruin. This was abandonment and decay dressed in green. The path to what must have been the front door was completely overgrown. She couldn't even see where the entrance was. Windows, if there were windows, were invisible beneath the curtain of leaves and vines. Mary stood in front of the structure, her bag slipping from her shoulder to the ground, and felt despair wash over her like a wave. This was what Thomas had spent 25 years on? This was his grand plan? To buy some piece of land in the middle of nowhere and let a cabin be eaten by plants? And this was supposed to help her? This was supposed to be his way of taking care of her future? Mary felt tears of frustration and grief and betrayal stream down her face. She sat down heavily on an overgrown stone that might have once been part of a garden wall, put her face in her hands, and cried. She cried for Thomas, for the loss that still felt impossible to accept. She cried for herself, for the lonely future stretching ahead. She cried for 40 years of marriage that had apparently included secrets she'd known nothing about. And she cried because after all this, the drive, the hope, the trust, Thomas's great secret was nothing but a forgotten cabin being reclaimed by the wilderness. "I don't understand," Mary said aloud, though there was no one to hear. "I don't understand what you were thinking, why you spent all that time here, why you didn't tell me what this was supposed to mean." She sat there for a long time as the sun moved across the sky and shadows began to lengthen. She should probably just go home. There was clearly nothing here worth saving, but she'd driven all this way, and Thomas had left her that key for a reason. With a sigh that came from somewhere deep in her chest, Mary stood up, wiped her eyes, and approached the green mountain that had once been a cabin. If nothing else, she could at least look inside. She owed Thomas, and herself, that much. Finding the door was the first challenge. Mary walked slowly around the perimeter of the structure, running her hands along the wall of vines and leaves, searching for any indication of an entrance. The vegetation was so thick she couldn't see the actual cabin underneath, just endless green. On what she guessed was the front side, facing the small clearing, she found a place where the vines seemed slightly less dense. When she pushed against them, she felt solid wood beneath. A door, or what had been a door. Mary began pulling at the vines, trying to clear them away. They resisted, clinging stubbornly to the wood and to each other. The work was hard, physical in a way she wasn't used to. Thorns from the climbing roses caught on her clothes and scratched her hands. Her fingers became stained green from the plant matter. Sweat ran down her face despite the cool air. As she worked, something strange began to happen. The plants she was cutting through didn't smell like ordinary wild vegetation. They smelled beautiful. The roses released a fragrance that was rich and complex, with hints of honey and something spicy. The vines, when cut, exuded a scent that was green and alive but also somehow sophisticated, like expensive perfume. And threading through everything was another smell, something she couldn't immediately identify, sweet and intoxicating, almost narcotic in its intensity. Mary paused in her work, breathing deeply. The fragrances were overwhelming, layering on top of each other, creating something that made her head swim slightly and her heart ache with a nostalgia she couldn't explain. Thomas had always smelled like growing things. She'd assumed it was from his work at the Parks Department, but this was the smell she'd always caught on his clothes when he came home from his project weekends. This exact combination of scents. He'd been here, Week after week, year after year, he'd been here among these plants. With renewed determination, Mary continued clearing the door. After nearly 30 minutes of work, she'd removed enough vegetation to reveal the entrance. An old wooden door, weathered but still solid, with a massive iron lock in the center. She pulled the key from her pocket. It slid into the lock as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. The mechanism was stiff from disuse, but with effort it turned. She heard the bolt slide back with a heavy clunk. Mary put her hand on the doorknob, also iron, cold and substantial, and pushed. The door resisted, swollen with moisture and blocked by vegetation, but she threw her weight against it. With a groan of old wood and hinges that hadn't moved in weeks, it swung inward. As it opened, something unexpected happened. Petals began to fall. Not metaphorical petals, but actual flowers. Dozens, then hundreds of them, cascading down from the vines above the doorway. They fell like snow, like confetti, like tears, covering the threshold and tumbling into the dark interior beyond. White petals, cream-colored, some tinged with the faintest blush of pink. They accumulated at Mary's feet, soft as silk, releasing as they fell a perfume so powerful and so achingly beautiful that Mary gasped. The fragrance that hit her was like nothing she'd ever experienced. It was jasmine, but jasmine amplified 1,000 times, so intensely sweet and heady that it almost hurt to breathe it. It was roses, but roses with a depth and complexity that made every rose she'd ever smelled before seem like a pale imitation. It was night-blooming flowers that shouldn't bloom in daylight, and it was green growing things, and it was something else entirely, something that smelled like memory, like longing, like love made manifest in scent. It hit her like a punch to the chest, exactly as the voiceover had promised. The smell was so powerful, so emotional, so immediately and overwhelmingly connected to Thomas that Mary literally staggered backward, her hand flying to her heart. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh, Thomas, what did you do?" Tears began streaming down her face before she could stop them. Not tears of frustration anymore, but tears of something else. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that whatever this was, it wasn't abandonment. It wasn't neglect. It was something else entirely. Mary stood in the doorway, waist-deep in fallen petals that continued to drift down around her like a blessing, breathing in the impossible fragrance, and felt the first crack in the wall of hurt and betrayal she'd built around her grief. These weren't wild plants. These weren't random weeds that had overtaken an abandoned cabin. These were cultivated, cared for, loved. Thomas hadn't abandoned this place. He'd created it, deliberately, carefully, with intention and planning and dedication that had spanned decades. With shaking hands, Mary pulled her phone from her pocket and turned on its flashlight. The afternoon sun couldn't penetrate the curtain of vines and leaves, so the interior was dark. She needed light to see what Thomas had made. She stepped over the threshold, petals crunching softly beneath her feet, and entered her husband's secret. The contrast between outside and inside was startling. Where the exterior had been wild and overgrown, consumed by vegetation, the interior was pristine. Mary's flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing a single large room that was clean, dry, and carefully maintained. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old wood, with undertones of the intense floral fragrances from outside. But inside, the scent was gentler, more controlled. The walls were rough-hewn logs, fitted together with obvious skill. The floor was wide plank wood, aged to a deep honey color. A simple stone fireplace occupied one wall. Windows, she could see them from inside, were covered with wooden shutters that explained why no light penetrated from outside. But what made Mary's breath catch were the flowers. Everywhere, on every surface hanging from the ceiling, arranged in careful rows along shelves, were flowers. Not wild and chaotic like outside, but carefully pressed, preserved, labeled. Mary moved deeper into the room, her flashlight illuminating what appeared to be a botanist's dream. Hundreds, maybe thousands of specimens were preserved here, but these weren't collected from nature. They were too perfect, too unusual. She approached one wall where specimens were mounted under glass in wooden frames. Each had a small label underneath, in Thomas's careful handwriting. Rosa Memoria Eterna, Hybrid E47, June 2003, Jasminum Nocturne Imperialis, Hybrid number 89, September 2007, Orchidaceae Tempus Perpetuus, Hybrid No. 156, March 2015. Mary read label after label, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. These weren't collected specimens, these were creations, hybrids, plants that Thomas had developed. Her husband, the quiet groundskeeper, had been breeding new varieties of flowers for years, decades. On a long table in the center of the room, Mary found leather-bound journals. She opened one carefully. The pages were filled with Thomas's neat handwriting, documenting crosses, results, successes, and failures. Dates going back 26 years. May 1997, attempted cross between R. damascena and R. gallica. Failed. Seedlings didn't germinate. August 1997, second attempt with modified soil pH. 3 seedlings survived, monitoring growth. June 1998, first bloom from Damascus gallica cross. Fragrance is remarkable, stronger than either parent, with notes I've never encountered in roses. Mary would love this. Saving seeds for propagation. Mary's hands trembled as she turned pages. Every entry mentioned her. Every successful bloom was described with "Mary would love this color," or "This scent would remind Mary of our garden," or "Saving this for when Mary can finally see it." He'd been thinking of her the entire time. Every weekend he'd spent here, every hybrid he'd created, every moment of work, it had all been for her. Mary found herself sinking into a chair beside the table, the journal open in her lap, tears falling onto the pages. She'd been so angry, so hurt that Thomas had kept secrets. But these weren't secrets born from deception. They were secrets born from, what? Love? Obsession? Some combination of both? A noise outside made her look up. For a moment, she'd almost forgotten where she was. In a cabin in the mountains, surrounded by her dead husband's secret life's work. She stood and opened one of the shuttered windows. The wooden slats moved easily, well maintained despite the years. Light flooded in and Mary gasped. From inside, looking out, she could now see what she'd missed before. The vines and flowers covering the cabin weren't random. They formed a living wall, a protective barrier, but they were also a garden. A vertical garden of extraordinary complexity and beauty. The thick vines she'd fought through were jasmine, not ordinary jasmine, but something with flowers twice the normal size, blooming in clusters so dense they formed cascades of white and cream. The roses climbing through them were varieties she'd never seen, with flowers ranging from palest blush to deep crimson, some striped, some with edges of different colors. And there were orchids growing in the open air, which shouldn't be possible in Vermont's climate. Yet here they were, thriving, their exotic blooms adding splashes of purple and gold to the living tapestry. Morning glories opened their trumpet flowers to the afternoon sun. Night-blooming cereus, which should only bloom in darkness, flowered alongside day-blooming varieties, creating an impossible display. Every plant was healthy, vigorous, clearly thriving. But more than that, they were beautiful in a way that transcended normal horticulture. These weren't just healthy plants. These were perfected plants, improved, enhanced. Mary realized with growing wonder that the entire structure, the cabin she'd thought was being destroyed by vegetation, was actually being protected by it. The plants formed a living roof, keeping rain off the wooden shingles. They created insulation, keeping the interior temperature stable. They filtered light, preventing the harsh sun from damaging the interior or its contents. Thomas hadn't let the cabin be overtaken by wild plants. He'd trained cultivated plants to form a protective barrier. He'd created a living building, a structure where plant and architecture worked together. The more Mary looked, the more she understood. This wasn't neglect. This was genius. But why? Why spend 25 years creating new flowers and hiding them in the mountains? The answer had to be somewhere in this cabin. Mary turned back to the interior, determined to find it. With light now streaming through the open windows, Mary could see the cabin properly, and what she saw made her heart break and soar simultaneously. One entire wall was covered in photographs, not randomly placed, but arranged chronologically, telling a story, the story of their life together. Mary approached slowly, her hand reaching out to touch the first photo. Thomas and Mary on their wedding day 40 years ago. She was wearing a simple white dress from JCPenney. He was in a borrowed suit. They were standing in her parents' backyard, grinning at the camera like they'd just won the lottery. Next to it, their first apartment, tiny and shabby, but theirs. Then Mary at her first teaching job, surrounded by second graders. Thomas receiving an award from the Parks Department. The two of them on vacation at Niagara Falls, one of their few trips together. The photos continued chronologically, Christmases, birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary days that Thomas had somehow captured and preserved. Mary had seen most of these photos before in their albums at home, but seeing them here, arranged on this wall, created a narrative that was more powerful than any individual image. This was their love story, told in pictures, but interspersed with the photos were other things: pressed flowers, small notes in Thomas's handwriting, dried leaves, feathers, stones. Each item had a small label with a date and location. Rose petal from Mary's bouquet, wedding day, June 1983. Leaf from the oak tree where I proposed, autumn 1982. Stone from the beach where Mary said yes, August 1982. Thomas had kept everything, every significant moment, every small treasure, every piece of their shared history. The wall was a museum of their marriage. Mary's fingers traced over the photos, the mementos, the physical evidence of 40 years of love. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of overwhelming emotion, grief and love and gratitude and loss all tangled together. You remembered everything, Mary whispered. You kept everything. She moved along the wall, following their story. The photos progressed through decades. They aged in the pictures, hair turning grey, faces gaining lines, bodies changing with time, but their smiles remained constant. In every photo, they looked happy. Near the end of the chronological display was a photo Mary had forgotten existed. Someone had taken it at a park picnic about 5 years ago. Thomas was showing Mary a flower. She remembered now. It was some kind of rare wildflower he'd found. In the photo, he was pointing at it excitedly, his whole face lit up with enthusiasm. And Mary was looking at him, not the flower, with an expression of such tender affection that seeing it now made her chest ache. That was who they'd been. That was what they'd had. The final section of the wall was different. Here, instead of photos, Thomas had hung sketches, architectural drawings, garden plans, botanical illustrations, all in his hand. Plans for this cabin. Drawings of hybrid flowers that didn't yet exist. Designs for the living wall of plants outside. And at the very end, a single frame holding a letter. Not the brief note Mary had found in the envelope, but a longer letter, several pages, carefully written. Mary unhooked the frame from the wall and carried it to the table, where light from the window illuminated it clearly. She sat down and began to read. My dearest Mary, if you've made it this far, you've probably already forgiven me a little bit for keeping secrets. I hope so anyway. You were always better at forgiveness than I deserved. I need to explain what this place is, and why I built it. 26 years ago, right after you retired from teaching, you got sick. Do you remember? It was just a bad flu, but you were in bed for 2 weeks and I was so scared. You'd never been seriously ill before, and watching you be weak and vulnerable made me realize something that terrified me. Someday, one of us would leave the other alone. I knew it would probably be me first. Men in my family don't live as long as the women. And the thought of you being alone, maybe struggling financially, maybe without security, it haunted me. I wanted to leave you something valuable, but we never had extra money for investments or savings. What we had was enough for us to live, but not enough to build security for after I was gone. so I decided to create value instead of buying it. I've always loved plants, as you know, and I'd always wondered if I could breed new varieties, better flowers, stronger scents, more beautiful colors. I started experimenting, just small attempts at first, cross-pollinating roses in our backyard, trying to create something unique. And Mary, it worked, better than I ever imagined. That first successful hybrid, the rose I call Rosa Memoria Eterna because it reminded me of you, it was something special. The scent was unlike anything I'd encountered, richer, more complex, longer lasting than either of its parents. I did some research and discovered that the perfume industry pays enormous amounts for unique fragrances, and pharmaceutical companies are always looking for new plant compounds for medicines. I realized I could do this. I could create something valuable, something that would take care of you when I couldn't anymore. But I needed space to work, space to grow experimental plants, space to fail, which I did many times, without you seeing and worrying about the wasted effort and expense. So I bought this land. It wasn't much, just a small clearing with an old hunting cabin on it. I spent every spare weekend for 2 years fixing up the cabin and establishing the growing conditions I needed. And then I started creating. Mary, I've developed 167 hybrid varieties over the last 25 years. Some are roses with unprecedented fragrance profiles. Some are jasmines that bloom more reliably and produce more essential oils. Some are orchids with medicinal properties that pharmaceutical researchers are interested in. Every plant you see covering this cabin, every specimen preserved inside, every seed and cutting I've saved, they're all my creations, and they're all valuable. I've already been in contact with several companies, though I haven't signed any deals yet. I wanted you to make those decisions. But I can tell you that the interest is significant. The perfume houses are particularly excited about the jasmine and rose hybrids. The pharmaceutical companies want samples of several of the orchids for testing. The estimates I've received suggest this collection could be worth several $100,000, maybe more, depending on how negotiations go. That money is yours. It's my gift to you, my way of making sure you're taken care of when I can't be there to do it myself. But Mary, I hope you won't just sell everything immediately. This place, I built it for you. It's our sanctuary. It's full of our memories and my love and all the beauty I could create. I hope you'll spend time here. I hope you'll find peace here. And if you want to keep it, to maintain it, maybe even to continue the work I started, that would make me happier than you can know. Everything I did here, I did thinking of you. Every flower I bred, I imagined you seeing it. Every scent I developed, I wondered if you'd love it. You were always my inspiration. You were always my reason. I'm sorry I kept this secret. I'm sorry I spent so many weekends away from you. But I hope, now that you can see what I was building, you understand why. I love you, Mary. I loved you for 40 years, and I'll love you in whatever comes after. This cabin, these plants, this work. It's all my love made visible. It's all for you, forever and always. Your Thomas. Mary finished reading and sat in silence, the letter resting in her lap, tears flowing freely down her face. He'd spent 25 years creating a future for her, 25 years breeding flowers and building security and planning for a time when he wouldn't be there to take care of her himself. Every weekend he'd said he was working on a project. He'd been here, cross-pollinating flowers, keeping records, building something beautiful and valuable from nothing but seeds and patience and love. And he'd never told her, because he knew she'd say it was impractical, that they should focus on the present instead of gambling on the future. He'd been protecting her from worry, while ensuring she'd be protected from poverty. Mary stood and walked to one of the open windows. Outside, the living wall of Thomas's hybrid plants swayed gently in the mountain breeze. The scent that drifted in was extraordinary, layers of fragrance so complex and beautiful that it almost seemed impossible that they could exist in nature. But they didn't exist in nature. Thomas had created them. He'd improved on nature, enhanced it, made it more than it had been before, just like he'd enhanced her life, made it more than it would have been without him. Thank you, Mary whispered to the cabin, to the plants, to Thomas wherever he was now. Thank you for loving me this much." She wiped her tears and looked around the cabin with new eyes. This wasn't a ruin. It wasn't abandonment. It was a gift. The greatest gift anyone had ever given her, and she was going to honor it. Mary spent the rest of that afternoon exploring the cabin thoroughly, and with each new discovery, her understanding of Thomas's work deepened. She found detailed journals documenting every hybrid he'd created, with notes about their characteristics, growing requirements, and potential uses. The documentation was meticulous. Thomas might have been self-taught, but he'd approached his work with scientific rigor. She found correspondence with botanists, perfumers, and pharmaceutical researchers, all expressing interest in his work. Thomas had been building relationships, establishing credibility, preparing the groundwork for what would come after he was gone. She found financial projections, conservative estimates of what his collection might be worth. The lowest estimate was $300,000. The highest approached $800,000, depending on how aggressively the hybrids were marketed and whether any proved to have significant medicinal properties. But the most profound discovery came late in the afternoon, when Mary found a large leather album on a shelf near the fireplace. She carried it to the table and opened it carefully. The first page had a title written in Thomas's hand, "Our Garden of Memories." What followed was extraordinary. Each page featured a photograph of one of Thomas's hybrid flowers in full bloom, beautifully composed and clearly photographed with great care. But alongside each photo was a story. Rosa Memoria Eterna, first successful hybrid, 1998. "Mary, this rose reminded me of you from the moment it bloomed. The color is the exact shade of blush you wore on our wedding day. The scent is sweet, but with an underlying strength, just like you. When you were nervous about starting your teaching career, you wore that same determined expression. This rose seems to carry in the way it holds its petals. I bred this to last longer than ordinary roses. A single bloom will stay perfect for 2 weeks, because you deserved flowers that wouldn't fade too quickly." A Jasminum Nocturne Imperialis, hybrid Nauter 89, 2007. "Do you remember our first apartment, Mary? The neighbor had jasmine growing on a trellis, and you loved sitting by the window smelling it on summer evenings. You said it smelled like hope. I've been trying for 9 years to create a jasmine that captures that memory. This one blooms more reliably, produces more flowers, and has that exact scent you loved. I call it Imperial Night, because you've always been royalty to me." Orchidaceae Tempus Perpetuus, hybrid W156, 2015. This orchid took 16 years to develop. 16 years of crosses, failures, and starting over. I almost gave up a dozen times. But then, I'd remember you telling your students that anything worth having is worth working for, and I'd try again. This orchid produces a compound that preliminary tests suggest has pain-relieving properties. It might help people, Mary, because you taught me that helping people is what makes life meaningful. Page after page, Thomas had documented not just his botanical achievements, but the memories, emotions, and moments from their marriage that had inspired each creation. It was a love letter written in flowers. Mary read every entry, tears streaming down her face, occasionally laughing at Thomas's descriptions of failed experiments, or his dry humor about setbacks. She could hear his voice in every word, see his face in her mind as he wrote about their shared history. The final entry in the album was dated just 2 months before Thomas's cancer diagnosis, Rosa Finis et Initium, final hybrid, 2023. "Mary, this is my last creation. I'm getting old, and my hands aren't as steady as they used to be. I probably have a few more years of work in me, but I wanted to make sure I ended with something special. This rose is white, like your wedding dress, but as it ages, it develops shades of gold, like the years we've spent together. The scent is everything I've learned how to create. Complex, enduring, impossible to fully describe. I call it the end and the beginning, because every ending is also a beginning. When I'm gone, you'll have a beginning here, in this sanctuary we built, even if you didn't know we were building it. I'm not afraid of endings anymore, Mary, because I know I'm leaving you something that will keep growing, keep blooming, keep becoming more beautiful with time, just like our love. Mary closed the album carefully, her hands shaking. She sat at the table as the afternoon light turned golden and tears flowed unchecked down her face. This was the moment the video title had promised, when Mary fully understood what Thomas had left her and broke down completely. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed, great, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep in her soul. She cried for Thomas, for the extraordinary man she'd been privileged to love for 40 years. She cried for herself, for the loneliness she'd been facing. She cried for the secret work he'd done, the silent dedication, the love that had driven him to create beauty for her benefit year after year. She cried because he'd been planning for her future even when he was healthy, even before he knew his time was limited. He'd been thinking about how to take care of her long before he had to say goodbye. And she cried because sitting in this cabin, surrounded by his life's work, she could feel how much he'd loved her. Not just in the abstract way love is usually described, but in concrete, measurable form. Every plant outside, every preserved specimen, every journal entry, every careful photograph, they were units of love, quantifiable evidence of devotion. Thomas Thornton had loved his wife so much that he'd spent 25 years creating a miracle for her. After a long time, Mary's sobs quieted to sniffles, then to silence. She wiped her eyes, took a shaky breath, and looked around the cabin with swollen eyes and a heart that felt simultaneously broken and more full than she'd thought possible. "You really did it, Thomas," she whispered. "You impossible, wonderful man. You really did take care of me." She stood and walked to the open window. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The hybrid flowers covering the cabin glowed in the light, more beautiful than any ordinary garden, and the scent, the incredible, complex, heartbreaking scent that wafted through the window, smelled like love and memory, and the promise that even when someone you love is gone, the love itself remains. Mary took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the perfume of Thomas's flowers, and made a decision. She wasn't going to sell everything and walk away. She was going to honor what Thomas had built. She was going to learn about the work he'd done and find ways to share it with the world while protecting what he'd created. This cabin, this sanctuary, this garden of miracles, it was her future. Not the sad, impoverished future she'd feared, but a future full of beauty and purpose, and the enduring presence of love. Thomas had left her exactly what she needed when the sun seemed like it would never shine again. He'd left her light. Mary spent that night in the cabin, sleeping on an old sofa Thomas had installed long ago, covered by a quilt she found in a chest, one she recognized from their early marriage, thought lost decades ago. She woke to dawn. Light filtered through the hybrid flowers covering the windows, creating a green-gold glow that was unlike anything she'd seen before. Her first action was to call the botanists and perfumers Thomas had been in correspondence with. Using the contact information in his journals, she reached out to 3 who had expressed the most interest in his work. All 3 were shocked to hear that Thomas had passed away. All 3 expressed immediate interest in examining his collection. Within a week, Mary had arranged for visits from representatives of major perfume houses and a pharmaceutical research company. Dr. Patricia Winters, from the New York Botanical Garden, was the first to visit. She was a distinguished woman in her 60s, who arrived with portable testing equipment and barely contained excitement. When Mary showed her the living wall of hybrid plants covering the cabin, Dr. Winters actually gasped. "This is Mrs. Thornton. Do you have any idea what your husband achieved here?" "I'm beginning to," Mary replied. "Please tell me what you see." Dr. Winters carefully examined several flowers, taking samples with Mary's permission, smelling each hybrid with the attention of a wine connoisseur. "These jasmines," she said, indicating the cascading white flowers, "produce approximately 3 times the essential oil of standard varieties. The chemical composition is unique. I'd need laboratory analysis to be certain, but the fragrance suggests compounds I've never encountered in natural jasmine." She moved to the roses. "These appear to be crosses involving old garden roses, but the colors and scent profiles are extraordinary. And the fact that they're growing here in these conditions, with this vigor, she shook her head in amazement. Your husband was gifted, Mrs. Thornton. Truly gifted. Over the next month, more experts visited. A perfumer from Paris spent an entire day smelling Thomas's hybrids, making notes, occasionally closing his eyes in what looked like religious rapture. These are, he said in accented English, miracles. Your husband created miracles. The pharmaceutical researchers were particularly interested in 2 orchid hybrids Thomas had developed. Preliminary tests suggested compounds with potential anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving properties. They couldn't make any promises, but the results were promising enough to warrant further research. By midsummer, the offers started coming in. A prestigious botanical garden wanted to establish a permanent collection of Thomas's hybrids, with Mary as the honored curator. They offered $450,000 for the rights to propagate and display the plants, plus a salary for Mary to oversee the collection. A luxury perfume house wanted exclusive rights to 3 of Thomas's rose and jasmine hybrids for their signature fragrances. Their offer was $325,000, plus ongoing royalties. A pharmaceutical company wanted to license 2 of the orchid hybrids for research. Their initial offer was $280,000, with additional payments if compounds proved commercially viable. Mary sat in the cabin, surrounded by Thomas's life's work, looking at offers totaling over $1 million, and tried to imagine what Thomas would want her to do. The answer came easily. Thomas would want her to be practical, but also to preserve what he'd built, to share the beauty he'd created while protecting its integrity. She negotiated carefully, taking her time, consulting with lawyers and financial advisors. In the end, she accepted modified versions of all 3 offers. The botanical garden would get propagation rights for educational purposes, but Mary retained ownership of the original specimens and the property. She accepted a position as consultant curator, paying $60,000 annually, allowing her to guide how Thomas's work would be shared with the public. The perfume house got limited exclusive rights to 3 hybrids, with strict stipulations about sustainable harvesting and attribution to Thomas. The payment was $350,000, plus 3% of sales revenues. The pharmaceutical company received licenses to research specific compounds, with agreements that any resulting medications would be reasonably priced and that Thomas's name would be associated with the discovery. Initial payment, $300,000, plus potential future royalties. Total immediate payment, $650,000, plus ongoing income. For a groundskeeper and a retired teacher who'd lived paycheck to paycheck their entire lives, it was a fortune. But more than the money, the agreements ensured Thomas's work would continue, would help people, would bring beauty to the world. Mary stood in front of the cabin on the day she signed the final contracts, looking at the living wall of Thomas's creations, and felt pride that was almost painful in its intensity. "You did it, love," she whispered. "You created something that will outlast both of us, something that will help people and bring joy and maybe even change lives." She thought about all those weekends Thomas had spent here, all those hours of patient work, all those years of keeping his secret. He'd been building a legacy, not for himself, but for her, for them, and now that legacy would grow beyond this cabin, would spread to gardens and laboratories and perfume bottles around the world. Thomas Thornton, the quiet groundskeeper, had created a miracle, and Mary Thornton was going to make sure the world knew his name. 1 year after finding the cabin, Mary sat on the newly restored porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. The cabin looked different now. The exterior had been stabilized, the roof properly repaired beneath its protective coat of hybrid flowers. The interior had been outfitted with solar power, modern amenities and comfortable furniture. But the essential character remained, Thomas's sanctuary, carefully preserved. Mary had spent the year learning everything she could about Thomas's work, reading his journals repeatedly, studying botany, learning how to care for the hybrid plants he'd created. She'd become, in her own right, an expert on his collection. She'd also become something of a celebrity in botanical circles. Articles had been written about The Groundskeeper's Garden, about Thomas's extraordinary achievement and the love story behind it. Mary had been interviewed for magazines and invited to speak at conferences. She'd shared Thomas's story generously, wanting the world to know about the quiet man who'd created beauty in secret for 25 years. The Botanical Garden had established the Thomas Thornton Memorial Garden, where his hybrids were displayed with placards explaining their development and his methods. School groups visited regularly, learning about plant breeding and dedication and love. The perfume house had released a signature scent called Eternally Remembered, based on Thomas's roses. Part of the proceeds went to botanical research in his name. The pharmaceutical research was ongoing, but preliminary results continued to be promising. If successful, a pain medication derived from Thomas's orchids could help thousands of people. But Mary's favorite result of the past year was simpler. She'd found peace. She visited the cabin twice a week, spending days there tending the plants, maintaining Thomas's records and simply being in the space he'd created. Here, surrounded by his work and his love, she felt close to him in a way that was comforting rather than painful. She'd learned that grief didn't disappear, but it could coexist with joy, with gratitude, with the satisfaction of purpose. A car was coming up the road now. Mary smiled, recognizing the vehicle. Dr. Winters from the Botanical Garden, along with a group of horticultural students coming for a tour. Mary had become a teacher again, but instead of second graders, she taught college students and serious plant breeders about Thomas's methods and the patience required to create something lasting. She stood and brushed off her pants, preparing to greet her guests. But before they arrived, she took a moment to walk around the side of the cabin to her favorite spot. There, in a specially prepared bed, grew the rose Thomas had called Finis et Initium, the end and the beginning, the final hybrid he'd created, white flowers gradually shading to gold as they aged. Mary had planted more of them, and now there was a whole bed of blooms in various stages, from pure white to deep gold, each stage beautiful in its own way. She touched one of the flowers gently. "I understand now," she said quietly. "I understand what you were trying to tell me. That endings are also beginnings, that love doesn't stop just because a heart stops beating, that beauty and purpose can grow from grief if we're patient and caring enough to cultivate them." The breeze carried the scent of Thomas's roses, his jasmine, his impossible orchids, fragrances he'd spent a lifetime developing, all for her. "You left me alone," Mary continued, "but you didn't leave me with nothing. You left me with everything that mattered. You left me beauty and security and purpose. You left me your love in a form that will last long after both of us are gone." She smiled through tears that were happy now, not sad. "You left me a garden, Thomas, and I'm going to tend it for as long as I'm able. I'm going to help it grow, help it spread, help it bring beauty to the world. Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for loving me enough to spend 25 years building tomorrow while living today. Thank you for the miracle." "Doctor." Winters's voice called from the front of the cabin. "Mrs. Thornton, we're here." "Coming," Mary called back. She gave the rose one last gentle touch, then turned toward the front of the cabin, toward her students, toward the work that gave her days meaning. As she walked, surrounded by Thomas's hybrid flowers, releasing their incredible fragrances into the mountain air, Mary Thornton felt something she hadn't felt since the day Thomas died. Complete. She was whole again, not because the grief was gone, but because she'd learned what Thomas had been trying to teach her all along, that love, when properly cultivated, doesn't end with death. It transforms. It grows. It becomes something that can nourish future generations. Thomas had taken his love and turned it into seeds and roots and blossoms that would outlast them both. And Mary, tending his garden, teaching others about his work, sharing the beauty he'd created, was doing the same. Their love had become immortal, not in memory alone, but in living, growing things that would bloom long after they were both gone. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the exact colors of Thomas's final hybrid. And in the fading light, surrounded by impossible flowers and impossible love, Mary Thornton smiled. If Mary and Thomas's story moved you, Please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We share powerful true stories every week about love, dedication, and the miracles that happen when we commit ourselves completely to the people we love. Leave a comment below. Have you ever discovered that someone loved you more than you realized? Has anyone ever built something extraordinary for you in secret? Share your story. Your experience might comfort someone who's grieving today. Mary and Thomas Thornton's journey teaches us profound truths about love, dedication, and the gifts we leave behind. Thomas teaches us that real love isn't just about the present. It's about planning for a future you might not be there to see. He spent 25 years every weekend working to ensure Mary would be cared for after he was gone. That's not just love. That's devotion elevated to an art form. Mary teaches us that the people we love sometimes keep secrets, but those secrets aren't always betrayals. Sometimes secrets are gifts being carefully prepared, wrapped in time and patience, waiting for the perfect moment to be revealed. Together, they teach us that love can be transformed into something tangible and lasting. Thomas took his feelings and turned them into flowers, into security, into a sanctuary that would outlast him. He literally bred new forms of beauty so that Mary would have something valuable when he couldn't be there to care for her himself. The story also reminds us not to judge what we don't understand. That cabin covered in vines looked like a worthless ruin, but underneath the wild exterior was something priceless. How often do we make that same mistake with people, with situations, with opportunities? How often do we look at surfaces and miss the treasures hidden beneath? Mary's grief was real and valid. The loneliness of losing a spouse after 40 years is profound. But Thomas gave her something that transformed her grief into purpose. The cabin gave her work to do, beauty to tend, a mission to fulfill. Sometimes the best gift we can give someone facing loss is not comfort, but purpose. For anyone dealing with grief right now, Mary's story offers hope. The pain doesn't disappear, but it can coexist with joy and meaning. The person you lost might have left you gifts you haven't discovered yet. Not material gifts necessarily, but lessons, memories, inspirations that can guide you forward. And for anyone in a relationship, Thomas's story is a challenge. What are you building for the person you love? Not just for today, but for tomorrow, for the future when you might not be there. Love isn't just about feelings. It's about actions, about planning, about creating things that will endure. Thomas spent 25 years creating hybrid flowers. He could have spent those weekends watching television or playing golf. He could have kept his plant breeding as a simple hobby without the dedication to perfection, but he chose to pour his time and creativity and effort into building something that would care for Mary when he couldn't. That's what love looks like when it's fully committed. That's what devotion means. The cabin covered in vines wasn't a ruin. It was a sanctuary. The seemingly worthless property wasn't a burden. It was a miracle. And the secrets Thomas kept weren't betrayals. They were gifts, carefully prepared over decades, waiting for the moment when Mary would need them most. Mary stood in that doorway, surrounded by falling petals, breathing in the impossible fragrances Thomas had created, and understood finally how much she'd been loved, not just in words or in moments, but in years of patient work done in secret, because he knew she'd need it someday. If someone you loved has passed away, look for their garden. Look for what they planted that's still growing. Look for the gifts they left that you haven't recognized yet. The love doesn't end just because they're gone. It continues in the things they built, the lessons they taught, the beauty they created. And if you love someone now, think about what you're planting for them. Not just for today, but for the tomorrows you might not share. What are you creating that will outlast you? What legacy of love are you building? Thomas Thornton, a simple groundskeeper, created miracles. Not through magic, but through patience, dedication, and love that was strong enough to work in secret for 25 years. He left his wife a cabin covered in vines, but underneath those vines was everything she needed: security, beauty, purpose, and the undeniable proof that she had been cherished beyond measure. That's the kind of love that changes the world. One flower, one hybrid, one carefully planted seed at a time. Thank you for joining us for Mary and Thomas's incredible journey. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that love endures, that dedication matters, and that the greatest gifts are often the ones that take years to fully appreciate. We'll see you in the next story.